When the richest man in the county signed her death warrant with a forged piece of paper and a cold smile, he had no idea he was driving her straight into a subterranean fortress that would save her life while his own empire froze to the ground. Today, you are going to see how a 26-year-old woman, armed with nothing but her late father's stonemasonry training and a deep comprehension of the Earth's thermal properties, engineered a subterranean refuge that defied the legal and physical forces of her community. While the wealthiest land barons in the county huddled around roaring, smoky fireplaces burning through a cord of wood a week just to keep their cabins above freezing, Nora Callaway slept in a steady 58 degrees on less than 4 small logs a day. If you want to recover the forgotten, highly efficient survival techniques of the American frontier that actually saved lives when it mattered most, hit that subscribe button right now. And drop a comment telling us where you are watching from. We read and value every single one. Now, let us look at the physics of the design that everyone in Iron Ridge, Nebraska, called a fool's errand, right up until the freeze of 1885 arrived to settle the argument. The sky above the Nebraska high plains had gone the color of old pewter on the October morning Nora Callaway split wood behind her cabin. It was not the clean gray of an ordinary rain cloud, but something far heavier and more deliberate, as if the atmosphere itself had reached a silent, unyielding decision. Nora stood at the heavy oak chopping block, her movements carrying the particular economy of a person who had never once considered waste. Each log met her axe blade at precisely the angle needed to split it clean through with no extra force exerted, the split halves falling to either side like a geometric problem neatly solved. Her shoulders and back held the dense, quiet strength of someone who had earned it over years of hard physical work, rather than months. The kind of core muscle that does not show through heavy wool until it is actively needed, and then surprises anyone who had foolishly assumed it was not there. She paused between logs, not from fatigue, but to tilt her face toward the northwest. Out on the horizon, the sky had taken on a bruised, yellowish cast beneath the pewter, the exact kind of sickly color that had no business appearing in mid-October. The cottonwoods along Cedar Creek had already shed their gold, their bare branches scratching at the wind like thin, desperate fingers. In every direction, the prairie grass lay flat and straw-colored, pressed down by a westerly breeze that had started 3 days ago, as a mere suggestion, and was now becoming a grim declaration. Nora lowered the axe head to the block, and stood reading what was in front of her the way her father had taught her to read everything. She looked not for what the landscape appeared to be, but for what it was actively doing. The wind direction, the yellow bruise in the northwest sky, and the particular dryness in the air that sat at the back of her throat like dry chalk, all told her the same truth. She nodded once to herself, confirming a suspicion she had held since sunrise, and then picked up the axe to finish the pile. Standing near the corner of the barn, watching her with a quiet, sidelong intensity, was Barnaby. Barnaby was an 8-year-old nanny goat, with a coat the color of dried chestnut leaves and amber eyes that possessed an uncanny, unnerving intelligence. Thomas Callaway, Nora's father, had brought Barnaby home in a burlap sack when the goat was just a kid, joking that a proper stonemason needed an assistant who understood the value of sure footing. Thomas had been a master stonemason by trade and a farmer by necessity, a man who understood the physical world through compressive strength, soil density, and thermal mass, the way other men understood Scripture. When Thomas died 2 years ago, in the bitter winter of 1883, he left Nora with 180 acres of hard Nebraska soil, a sturdy cabin built by his own hands, and a deep, practical education in how the earth worked beneath their feet. The iron-rimmed wheels of a heavy spring wagon groaned against the frozen ruts of the road just after noon. Nora did not need to look up from her work to know who was coming, but she set her axe down deliberately anyway and stepped out from behind the woodpile. The wagon carried 2 men. Sitting on the high bench seat, wrapped in a heavy beaver-collared coat that signaled his wealth to anyone within a mile, was Vance Thorne. Thorne was the undisputed land baron of Iron Ridge, a speculator who had spent the last decade accumulating claims from struggling homesteaders through a combination of high-interest loans, legal maneuvering, and outright intimidation. Beside him, Holding the reins with a look of profound, quiet misery, sat Sheriff Harlan Briggs. Sheriff Briggs was a large, broad-shouldered man whose posture usually carried authority, but today he looked shrunk inside his county-issued coat, his eyes persistently avoiding Nora's face, to fixate on a distant fence post. Thorne did not bother with pleasantries. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a folded parchment document bearing an official court seal, and held it out toward Nora with a hand clad in fine kidskin leather. He explained that the paper was a legally binding deed of transfer. According to Thorne, her late father had taken out a secret loan of $400 in the autumn of 1882, putting up the entire 180-acre homestead as collateral. Because the debt had never been satisfied, the county court in Lincoln had officially foreclosed on the property, transferring full ownership to Vance Thorne. Nora took the document. Her hands were raw from the cold wind, but her grip was completely steady as she unfolded the parchment. She did not read the legal jargon. Her eyes went straight to the bottom of the page, where her father's signature was scrawled above the notary stamp. She studied the ink for less than 10 seconds before she looked up directly into Vance Thorne's eyes. Her father had suffered from severe, crippling arthritis in his right wrist during the last 3 years of his life, a direct consequence of 40 years spent wielding a 10-pound stone hammer in all weather. Because of that physical limitation, Thomas Callaway's handwriting had changed in a very specific, diagnostic way. He could no longer make wide, flowing loops. His capital letters were tight, square, and compressed, and his trailing lowercase letters always ended flat against the page, because his wrist could not execute an upward flourish without intense pain. The signature on Thorne's document featured a wide, sweeping loop on the capital T and a dainty, curved upward hook on the final Y of Callaway. It was the signature of a man with fluid, painless wrist movement. A careless imitation written by someone who had copied an old document from Thomas's youth without understanding the biological reality of the man who supposedly signed it. Nora pointed her thumb directly at the forged loop and told Thorne plainly that her father had not signed the paper. She stated that Thomas Callaway had never borrowed a single penny in his life, and that his wrist could not physically execute the flourishes on the parchment. Thorne's expression did not soften by a fraction. He merely smiled, a thin, hollow stretch of his lips that held no warmth whatsoever. He told her that the county court did not concern itself with the medical history of a dead man's wrist. The seal on the paper was genuine, the judge's signature was real, and the law recognized the document as absolute truth. He informed her that she had until the first snowfall to pack whatever personal items she could carry in a single sack and vacate the land. If she remained on the property when the snow began to fall, Sheriff Briggs would be forced to remove her by physical force and arrest her for criminal trespassing on Vance Thorne's legal property. Nora looked past Thorne at Sheriff Harlan Briggs. The sheriff finally looked at her, his face flushed with a deep, burning shame. Briggs knew Thomas Callaway had been an honest man. He knew Thorne was a predator who used forged paper and corrupt city judges to steal improved land. But Briggs also owed Thorne over $1,200 on a personal mortgage for his own family's farm, a debt Thorne would call in the moment the sheriff refused to enforce his orders. The sheriff swallowed hard, looked down at his horse's ears, and said nothing. Nora handed the fraudulent paper back to Thorne, turned her back on both of them without saying another word, and walked toward her house. The 5-mile walk into the town of Iron Ridge was a cold, brutal trek against a rising wind that blew flat across the open prairie. Nora walked with a long, measured stride, her canvas bag slung over her shoulder, with Barnaby trotting faithfully at her side. When she entered the town's main street, the atmosphere was thick, with a strange, nervous tension. The sky had darkened further, turning from pewter to a deep, bruised slate gray. Storefront signs rattled violently on their iron hinges, and the few townsfolk out on the wooden boardwalks moved quickly, pulled their coats tight, and avoided eye contact with her. Word of Thorne's eviction order had already reached the town through the local telegraph operator, and in a small frontier community where Vance Thorne owned the bank, the grain elevator, and half the mortgages, sympathy for an evicted orphan was a dangerous luxury nobody felt they could afford. Nora walked directly into Thaddeus Finch's general store. The store was warm, heated by a large cast-iron belly stove in the center of the room, and smelled of kerosene, dried tobacco, and green coffee beans. Thaddeus Finch, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a nervous twitch in his cheek, was wiping down the wooden counter with a dry rag when she walked in. Nora set her canvas bag on the counter and asked to purchase basic supplies on her father's standing credit account. Specifically, a 10-pound sack of coarse salt, 2 boxes of sulfur matches, a heavy bone-sewing needle, a spool of waxed thread, 2 lead graphite pencils, and a thick tablet of plain paper. Thaddeus Finch stopped wiping the counter. He looked at the floor, his hands trembling slightly around the rag, and told her in a hushed, strained voice that he could not extend her credit. He explained that Vance Thorne had visited the store less than an hour ago and informed him that if Finch extended a single penny of credit to Nora Callaway, Thorne would immediately foreclose on the store's inventory loan. Finch apologized, his voice cracking with genuine regret, but he made no move to reach for the supplies. Nora did not argue or plead. She reached deep into her coat pocket, pulled out her small leather coin purse, and emptied her entire life savings onto the wooden counter, 3 silver dollars and 4 copper pennies. She asked Finch how much salt, matches, paper, and graphite those coins would buy outright. Finch weighed out a smaller 5-pound sack of salt, handed her the matches, the needle, the thread, the graphite, and a smaller stack of paper, and quietly pushed one of the silver dollars back across the counter toward her, telling her it was a discount on the salt. Nora took the coin, placed the supplies in her bag, and walked out. On the boardwalk outside, she was intercepted by Clara Foss, the pastor's wife. Clara was a kind, frail woman whose face was drawn with worry. She grabbed Nora's hands in her own gloved ones and pleaded with her to come stay at the church rectory. Clara explained that she and Pastor Gideon Foss had a small, unheated attic room above the vestry where Nora could stay through the winter, provided she helped with the church laundry and cleaning. Nora looked at Clara's kind, anxious face and gently withdrew her hands. She thanked Mrs. Foss for her generosity, but politely declined the offer. She explained that she had no intention of becoming a burden or sleeping in a cramped attic while Vance Thorne enjoyed the fruits of her father's labor. When Clara asked where she would possibly go with a blizzard coming, Nora simply replied that her father had never left her unprovided for and turned toward the western road. As she walked out of Iron Ridge, Nora did not look at the houses or the people. Instead, she looked at the natural world around her, collecting data points with the cold precision her father had taught her. She noticed that along the banks of Cedar Creek, the local beaver population had raised the mud and stick walls of their lodges by fully 10 inches higher than they had the previous autumn, a clear sign that the water below the ice would freeze far deeper than usual. She looked down at the dirt road and saw dozens of woolly bear caterpillars crawling frantically across the ruts. Every single one of them was solid black from head to tail, without a single band of reddish-brown fur, an old frontier indicator that presaged an exceptionally long, unbroken Arctic freeze. Furthermore, the wild geese had flown south 3 full weeks ahead of their usual schedule, their high V formations cutting through the sky in a desperate hurry. Nature was not guessing. It was preparing for a catastrophe. Nora tightened her grip on Barnaby's lead rope and continued walking directly toward the western bluffs. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the sky finally broke open. It did not start with soft, fluffy snowflakes, but with hard, bitter grains of ice that drove sideways out of the northwest at 40 miles an hour. The temperature, which had hovered near 30 degrees at noon, plummeted like a dropped stone, falling 15 degrees in less than an hour. The townsfolk of Iron Ridge assumed Nora would head east, along the established stagecoach trail, toward the larger settlement of Kearney, where she might find work or charity. Going east was the logical, human choice. But as Nora reached the western boundary of her stolen homestead, where the flat prairie gave way to rugged, uncultivated limestone hills, Barnaby suddenly stopped. The goat turned her head toward the rocky bluffs in the west, flared her nostrils to catch the scent of the freezing wind, and let out a sharp, decisive bleat. She did not tug toward the east or look back at the warm cabins sitting in the distance. Instead, Barnaby stepped off the marked trail and began marching deliberately up a steep, rocky ravine that led directly into the heart of the wild, uninhabited bluffs. Nora did not hesitate for a single second. She adjusted the heavy canvas pack on her back, which contained her 3 wool blankets, her sharp-splitting axe, her small cast-iron pot, her salt, matches, and tools, and followed the goat into the rising whiteout. The blizzard quickly intensified into a blinding storm. Within 20 minutes, all landmarks behind them vanished under a wall of swirling white chaos. The wind howled through the dry ravine brush like a wounded animal, throwing freezing sleet directly into Nora's face. The trail, if it could even be called that, was nothing more than a series of jagged limestone ledges and dense thickets of wild plum and scrub oak. In a whiteout of this magnitude, an adult human can easily lose all sense of direction within 50 yards, walking in fatal circles until hypothermia sets in. But Barnaby moved with a bizarre, unwavering certainty. The goat picked her way over the ice-glazed rocks without a single slip, her hooves finding secure footholds on the hidden ledges. Whenever the wind gusted so hard that Nora was forced to stop and hunch over to catch her breath, Barnaby would stand directly in front of her legs, using her thick coat to shield Nora's knees from the biting frost. Nora trusted the animal completely. She knew that livestock raised by a man like Thomas Callaway were not ordinary farm beasts. Thomas had spent years surveying these western bluffs for high-quality building stone, often taking Barnaby along as a pack animal on long summer expeditions. The goat knew these hills better than any surveyor in the territory. As they climbed higher into the bluffs, the cold grew sharper, biting through Nora's heavy wool coat and stiffening the leather of her boots. The sleet turned into dense, heavy snow that accumulated rapidly on the ground, burying the rocks under 6 inches of fresh white powder. Yet Barnaby never paused or strayed from her course. She pushed through the deepening drifts, her head low, her amber eyes focused entirely on a destination that lay somewhere ahead in the frozen darkness. After nearly 2 hours of fighting the storm uphill, Barnaby abruptly turned right, scrambling up a steep, south-facing embankment, and came to a complete halt beneath the sprawling canopy of an ancient red cedar tree. The cedar was a massive, gnarled giant that had stood on the southern slope of the bluff for over a century. Its trunk was thick as a wagon wheel, and its heavy, needle-laden branches bowed deeply toward the earth under the weight of the falling snow, creating a natural, dry umbrella beneath its canopy, where the ground was virtually free of drifts. Nora stumbled under the shelter of the cedar's lower branches, gasping for air, her eyelashes heavy with frost. Barnaby immediately walked over to a specific spot near the base of the tree's massive trunk, lowered her head, and began frantically pawing away the thick layer of fallen cedar needles and dry soil covering the earth. Nora dropped to her knees beside the goat and helped clear the debris with her gloved hands. Beneath 4 inches of accumulated pine needles and dry dirt, her fingers struck cold, smooth rock. She brushed away the remaining dirt, exposing a massive, flat slab of gray limestone. The slab was roughly 4 feet long, 3 feet wide, and at least 4 inches thick. It sat completely flush with the surrounding hillside, fitted so seamlessly into the natural rock formation that anyone walking past would have assumed it was merely a natural outcrop of the limestone bluff. But Nora knew better. As she cleared the edges of the stone, she saw the undeniable marks of human craft, a neat, hand-chiseled groove running around the entire perimeter of the slab, and a small, rectangular recess carved directly into the front edge, designed specifically to accept the flat pole of a heavy axe or iron crowbar. This was her father's secret. 12 years ago, when Nora was just 14, Thomas Callaway had spent 3 full months working alone in these western bluffs under the guise of hunting for building stone. He had come home every evening with red clay on his boots and dust in his beard, refusing to answer detailed questions about what he was constructing, only telling her with a quiet smile that a wise builder always builds a second foundation where no greedy man can find it. Nora stood up and unstrapped her splitting axe from her pack. She inserted the heavy, flat pole of the axe head deep into the carved recess beneath the limestone slab. The stone was immensely heavy, weighing at least 350 pounds, and the winter cold had sealed the perimeter seam with a thin layer of frozen ice. Nora planted her boots firmly against the frozen ground, locked her arms, and threw her entire body weight backward against the wooden axe handle, using it as a mechanical lever. The handle groaned under the immense strain. For a terrifying 3 seconds, nothing moved. Nora reset her footing, took a deep breath of the freezing air, and drove down with a sudden violent surge of force. The ice seal in the seam shattered with a sound like a pistol shot. The massive stone slab lifted 3 inches, grinding loudly against the surrounding rock. Nora quickly kicked a smaller stone under the lifted edge to hold the gap, then repositioned her axe and walked the heavy slab sideways, inch by inch, until the opening beneath was fully exposed. The moment the slab moved aside, a thick wave of warm, dry air rushed out of the dark opening into the freezing storm. It was not cold, biting air, but air that registered at a steady, unbelievable 50 degrees Fahrenheit, smelling rich with dark earth, dried cedar, and the distinct, mineral scent of hand-cut limestone. Nora pulled a tallow candle, and her matchbox from her coat, struck a match inside the shelter of her palm, and held the small flame over the dark opening. A flight of 9 flat limestone steps descended steeply into the earth. The steps were hand-chiseled and set securely into the surrounding rock, completely dry and free of ice. Nora gestured to Barnaby. The goat needed no encouragement. She immediately hopped down the stone steps into the darkness below, her hooves clicking softly on the smooth rock. Nora followed her down, lowering the heavy limestone slab back over the entrance until only a 2-inch gap remained open for light and initial air. When her boots touched the bottom floor, Nora lit a second candle and looked around in stunned silence. She was standing in a spacious, perfectly rectangular subterranean room, measuring 12 feet wide, 14 feet long, and 8 feet high from the earthen floor to the heavy timber ceiling overhead. The walls were not bare dirt. They were lined from floor to ceiling with thick, beautifully fitted dry-stacked limestone blocks, laid without a drop of cement mortar, yet fitted together with such mathematical precision that not a single grain of dirt seeped through the seams. Against the far wall stood a neat, organized cache of survival supplies that her father had quietly hauled here over a decade ago. There were 2 50-pound canvas sacks of dried pinto beans wrapped in heavy oilcloth, a sealed wooden crate containing 100 pounds of white flour, 6 sealed tin cans of lard, 4 large stoneware crocks of salt pork, a 10-gallon oak keg of sweet sorghum molasses, a crate of 50 handmade tallow candles, 3 rolls of copper wire, a full set of stonemason's hand tools, and a stack of seasoned cedar firewood piled neatly in the corner. On top of the flour crate, placed directly in the center where it could not be missed, sat a heavy oilskin pouch sealed with a brass clip. Nora walked over, her hands trembling slightly, and unclipped the pouch. Inside were 2 folded sheets of thick paper written in her father's unmistakable handwriting. She unfolded the first sheet. The letters were tight, square, and compressed, the exact arthritis-restricted hand she had defended to Thorne 3 hours ago. The note was short, containing only 7 words. "If you found this, you'll know what to do." Nora pressed the paper against her lips, a single hot tear finally spilling over her eyelashes and tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. It was so completely Thomas Callaway. No dramatic sentimentality, no self-pity, just absolute, unshakable faith in her ability to handle whatever crisis had driven her underground. She unfolded the second sheet. This one contained a detailed hand-drawn blueprint of the room, accompanied by a longer note. "Daughter, I built these walls 8 feet deep where the frost can never reach. The earth here stays 50 degrees whether the sky is burning or freezing. But I left the heating stove unfinished in the corner. I left you 9,000 pounds of cut sandstone, the clay pipe sections, and the ironwood flue. I did not build the stove for you because a shelter built entirely by another man's hands is only a temporary hiding place. What your own hands construct belongs to you forever. Build the firebox the way I taught you. Trust the stone. Trust the earth." Nora looked over at the northern corner of the room. Stacked neatly against the wall was a massive pile of flat-faced sandstone blocks, 2 thick sections of fired clay pipe, 3 hollowed ironwood logs for the upper flue, and a heavy canvas sack containing 50 pounds of dried, pulverized red clay. Her father had provided everything: the sanctuary, the food, the tools, and the materials. But he had deliberately left the final, crucial element of survival for her to build with her own strength. Nora wiped her cheeks with the back of her sleeve, set her candle on the flower crate, and smiled for the first time in 3 weeks. Nora did not waste time resting. She knew that while the ambient 50-degree temperature of the underground room was survivable, an extended Arctic freeze would slowly sap her body heat if she could not generate active, radiant warmth to dry out the room and heat her living space. She began by analyzing the materials her father had left for the stove. The sandstone blocks were dense, fine-grained rock taken from the lower river bluffs, weighing roughly 20 pounds each. Sandstone was a superior material for heat storage. It possessed a high specific heat capacity, meaning it absorbed thermal energy slowly and released it over many hours through gentle infrared radiation. However, constructing a stove inside an enclosed earth shelter required a deep understanding of clay chemistry and thermal expansion. If she used plain dirt or improper mortar, the intense 1200-degree heat of a wood fire would cause the mortar to dry out, shrink, and crack, releasing lethal carbon monoxide gas into her living chamber. Nora carried her cast-iron pot up the stone steps, scooped up 3 full pots of fresh, powdery snow from the storm outside, and brought them back down to the chamber. She set the pot near her candle flame to melt the snow into water. Next, she opened the canvas bag of dried red clay her father had gathered from the south bank of Cedar Creek. This clay was deep crimson in color, owing to a very high concentration of iron oxide. Iron-rich clays were extraordinarily dense and could withstand immense thermal stress without breaking down. Using an empty wooden crate as a mixing trough, Nora combined the red clay with Sharp Creek sand she found in a second supply sack and chopped dried prairie grass, in a precise ratio her father had hammered into her memory. 3 parts sharp sand, 2 parts iron clay, and 1 part chopped grass binder. The sand acted as a stable structural aggregate, preventing the clay from shrinking as it dried. The grass fibers created a micro-reinforcing matrix throughout the mortar, allowing the joints to flex slightly during the stove's rapid heating and cooling cycles without cracking. She poured the lukewarm snowmelt into the trough and mixed the mortar with her bare hands, kneading the thick, red paste until it reached the exact consistency Thomas had taught her, holding its shape firmly in a ball without sticking to her skin. Nora then began laying the foundation of the stove against the north limestone wall. She set the largest, flattest sandstone blocks in a double layer, directly on the earthen floor, spreading a half-inch layer of red clay mortar between each joint. She constructed a firebox measuring 2 feet wide, 2 feet deep, and 2 feet high. But instead of building a simple, open box that would dump its heat straight up the chimney, Nora incorporated a double-chamber horizontal draft path. The hot exhaust gas from the main firebox was forced to travel horizontally through a secondary heat exchange baffle lined with dense sandstone before reaching the vertical flue pipe. This serpentine path forced the rising thermal energy to remain inside the stove's structure for twice as long as a conventional fireplace. By the time the exhaust gases finally exited through the clay flue pipe, the 2,200 pounds of sandstone blocks surrounding the firebox would have absorbed up to 80% of the fire's total energy, storing it as latent heat that would radiate into the room for 10 hours after the fire had died down to cold ash. While the clay mortar on the masonry stove set, Nora turned her attention to the floor. She knew an essential physical law that most frontier builders completely ignored. Cold air is physically heavier and denser than warm air. At -20 degrees Fahrenheit, cold air has a density of roughly 0.086 pounds per cubic foot, making it significantly heavier than the warm air generated by a stove, which sits at a much lighter 0.076 pounds per cubic foot. In any enclosed room, the coldest, most dangerous air molecules automatically sink to the lowest available point on the floor. If a person sleeps directly on a flat floor, they are constantly sleeping in the coldest, dampest air layer in the house. To solve this problem, Nora picked up her flathead shovel and began digging a continuous trench around the entire outer perimeter of the room's earthen floor. She cut the channel 5 inches wide and 7 inches deep, carving a neat, rectangular ditch that ran along the base of all 4 limestone walls, stopping only at the base of the entrance stairs. This channel acted as a convective cold trap. Any cold air that leaked through the entrance slab or seeped through the upper timber joints was immediately pulled down into this perimeter ditch by gravity. The freezing air pooled safely inside the 7-inch trench below the floor level, leaving the main central floor area significantly warmer. Next, Nora addressed the crucial issue of airflow. An airtight underground room will quickly suffocate its occupants if it lacks fresh oxygen, but an open hole will let in freezing drafts that destroy the room's heat. Nora installed the 4-inch fired clay intake pipe low on the north wall, setting it directly into the limestone masonry so its exterior mouth drew fresh air from outside near ground level while its interior mouth emptied into the base of the masonry stove. This supplied the firebox with fresh oxygen directly from the outside, preventing the stove from consuming the oxygen inside her living space. For the exhaust, she fitted the hollow ironwood flue pipe high on the south ceiling beam, running it through a pre-cut hole in the ceiling timbers and sealing the exit point on the hillside above with packed clay and stone. With both pipes installed, Nora decided to test the draft. She placed a handful of dry pine bark and grass inside the firebox, struck a match, and set it alight. For the first 30 seconds, the fire burned bright. But then, without warning, a thick plume of acrid black smoke suddenly billowed out of the firebox door, filling the chamber with choking fumes. The draft had reversed. Nora covered her mouth with her sleeve, her eyes stinging, and immediately smothered the fire with a handful of dry dirt. She sat near the floor intake pipe, breathing the fresh air coming through the clay tube, and analyzed the failure. She realized the problem was not her stove design. It was an exterior obstruction. She lit a candle, grabbed a 10-foot length of stiff copper wire from the supply pile, and climbed up the stone steps into the roaring blizzard outside. Fighting her way through 3 feet of fresh snow on the hillside, she located the ironwood exhaust pipe sticking out of the ground. She thrust the long copper wire deep into the pipe opening. 3 feet down, the wire struck a solid plug. Nora worked the wire in a vigorous, churning motion until the blockage gave way a dense ball of dried oak leaves and pine needles that had been blown into the pipe by autumn winds before the snow arrived. Nora blew hard into the pipe to clear the loose debris, then scrambled back down the stone steps into the warmth of the chamber. She relit the kindling in the firebox. This time, the draft established itself instantly. The flames roared cleanly, and the smoke was pulled smoothly up through the ironwood flue, creating a quiet, powerful convective loop that began pulling fresh air through the floor intake and circulating warmth through the entire chamber. To maximize her personal comfort and conserve firewood during the coldest nights, Nora implemented a third layer of thermal control, an isolated inner microclimate known as a blanket tent. Using her hand auger, she drilled 4 small holes into the heavy ceiling timbers directly above a raised cedar plank sleeping platform her father had built in the quietest corner of the room. She drove wooden pegs into the holes, attached heavy hemp rope to the pegs, and suspended 3 thick wool blankets from the ceiling. The blankets hung down to the floor, enclosing the sleeping platform in a cozy 4-foot by 6-foot inner tent. This reduced the volume of air she needed to heat while sleeping from 1,300 cubic feet down to just 140 cubic feet. Nora took 3 smooth, heavy river stones from the supply pile, each weighing about 15 pounds, and placed them directly on top of the flat sandstone cap of the masonry stove. She maintained a steady, moderate fire in the stove for 3 hours. The iron-rich clay mortar cured hard as red brick under the heat, locking the sandstone firebox into a solid, unbreakable mass. The 2,000 pounds of stone absorbed the energy from the burning pine, becoming warm to the touch. The 3 river stones on top of the stove absorbed intense heat, glowing faintly in the dim light. Using thick canvas pads to protect her hands, Nora lifted the hot river stones off the stove, carried them into her blanket tent, and placed them inside a shallow iron pan on the floor of the tent. She closed the blanket flaps tight and sat down on her pine needle mattress. The transformation was extraordinary. Within 20 minutes, the radiant heat from the 3 river stones, trapped inside the small wool enclosure, raised the temperature inside the blanket tent to a balmy, incredibly comfortable 62 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside the underground keep, the Nebraska blizzard raged with terrifying force, pushing the ambient air temperature down to 15 degrees below zero. In the main stone chamber, the thermometer hung on the limestone wall read a stable 48 degrees. But inside Nora's blanket tent, protected by 8 feet of earth, 2,000 pounds of thermal mass stone and wool insulation, she sat in her shirt sleeves, sipping a hot cup of tea made from melted snow and dried peppermint. Barnaby the goat settled comfortably into her three-sided timber pen in the corner of the main room, chewing her cud contentedly in the dry 48-degree air. The goat's body heat alone generated roughly 300 BTUs of energy per hour, contributing to the baseline thermal stability of the chamber. Nora checked her wood supply. She had consumed less than 1/20th of a cord of wood during the entire build and testing process. At this rate, her stored timber would last her not just through one winter, but through 2 full years of continuous Arctic weather. She laid her head down on the soft pine needle pillow, wrapped a single blanket over her shoulders, and slept deeply for 8 unbroken hours, completely undisturbed by the howling storm above. On the 12th of November, 1885, the great Arctic front that nature had been warning about for 2 months finally struck the northern plains in full force. Historians would later record it as the most severe early winter cold snap in Nebraska's recorded history. The barometer dropped to unprecedented lows as an Arctic air mass swept down from northern Canada, driving ambient air temperatures down to an astounding 42 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. The wind sustained speeds of 50 miles per hour, with gusts exceeding 65, creating a wind chill factor that approached 75 degrees below zero. On the south-facing slope of the bluff, the fierce winds scoured snow off the higher rocks and dumped it directly over the cedar tree, building a massive, wind-compacted snowdrift 5 feet deep over the roof of Nora's subterranean keep. To an inexperienced homesteader, being buried under 5 feet of snow sounded like a death sentence, but to Nora, it was the final, perfect layer of insulation. Compacted wind-drifted snow has a high density of trapped air pockets, giving it an insulation performance rating of approximately R1 per inch of depth. That 60-inch snowdrift, sitting over her ceiling timbers, provided an additional R60 insulation barrier directly above her room. Combined with the 8 feet of solid earth and the dry-stacked limestone walls, Nora's keep was now encased in an insulation envelope exceeding R140. Inside the keep, the extreme storm outside was completely silent. Nora could not hear the wind. She could only feel a faint, rhythmic vibration in the ceiling timbers when the strongest gusts hit the top of the cedar tree above. Her daily routine became a masterpiece of relaxed efficiency. She woke at 7 each morning, stepped out of her warm blanket tent into the 48-degree main room, and lit 4 small split logs in her masonry stove. She let the fire burn hot for 45 minutes, allowing the double-chamber flue to charge the sandstone mass, and then closed the stove draft damper to let the coals smolder. That single 45-minute firing was all the active heating the room required for the entire day. The 2,000 pounds of sandstone slowly released its stored energy into the chamber, keeping the temperature inside the room at a steady 58 degrees Fahrenheit all day long. Nora consumed between 6 and 10 small logs per day, representing a full 75% reduction in fuel consumption compared to standard prairie log cabins. She spent her days reading her father's books by candlelight, mending her clothes, grinding corn, and caring for Barnaby, living not in miserable survival mode, but in genuine, quiet comfort. 3 miles to the east, in the valley below, the town of Iron Ridge and its surrounding homesteads were experiencing a catastrophic collapse of their infrastructure. Vance Thorne's brand-new $15,000 cattle barn built in September using unseasoned green pine lumber to save time became a death trap. Greenwood contains up to 50% moisture by weight locked inside its plant cells. When the minus 42-degree Arctic air hit the unseasoned timber, the moisture inside the wood fibers evaporated rapidly into the bone-dry air, causing the planks to shrink, twist, and split with loud popping sounds. Within 48 hours, 1-inch gaps opened up between every single board on the barn's windward wall. The 50-mile-per-hour wind blew straight through the structure, turning the interior of Thorne's modern barn into a freezing gale. Worse still, Thorne's expensive above-ground well house constructed from thin, fashionable stone veneer, with no earth sheltering or insulation, turned into a solid block of ice. The freezing cold penetrated 3 feet into the ground, freezing the main water pipe solid and cutting off all water to his 40 head of prized Hereford cattle. Without water, the cattle began dehydrating rapidly, huddling together in the freezing corners of the drafty barn. In Iron Ridge, the situation among the townspeople was equally desperate. Families were burning through their winter firewood piles at 3 times the normal rate, feeding their drafty, single-wall log cabins 30 to 40 logs a day, just to keep their living room floors from dropping below freezing. Because most homesteaders stored their cordwood outside under thin canvas tarps or open lentos, the October sleet and November snow had soaked into the wood stacks. When the temperature dropped to -40, the wet wood froze into solid blocks of ice. When desperate men pried the frozen logs apart and threw them into their fireplaces, the wood hissed, steamed, and smoldered, producing vast clouds of thick, acrid smoke that filled the cabins while generating almost no heat. Chimneys across the county clogged with heavy creosote, causing dangerous flue fires or forcing families to open their doors to clear the smoke, letting the killing cold pour inside. By the 4th day of the freeze, families were burning their wooden furniture, fence posts, and wagon wheels. Children slept in 6 layers of clothes under mountain piles of quilts, their breath freezing into thick crusts of ice on their blankets. The town was freezing to death in its own houses. At 4 o'clock on the morning of November 16th, while the blizzard raged outside at -35 degrees, Nora was awakened by a faint, muffled thumping sound coming from the stone entrance slab above the stairs. She immediately threw on her wool coat, grabbed her axe, and climbed the stone steps. She unlatched the heavy wood inner door and pushed open the stone slab. Standing in the knee-deep snow, wrapped in a threadbare quilt, and shivering so violently he could barely hold himself upright, was Samuel Hayes. Samuel was a young homesteader who lived 2 miles to the south. In his arms, wrapped inside a frozen wool blanket, he held his 6-year-old son Jonah and his 4-year-old daughter Betsy. Samuel's wife had fallen ill with a high fever 3 days prior, and their drafty cabin had run completely out of dry firewood at midnight. Desperate, with his children's hands turning white, and his home dropping to 12 degrees, Samuel had gathered the children and walked into the blinding storm, praying he might find shelter before they froze to death. He had seen the tiny wisp of smoke rising from the cedar tree bluff and had followed it in sheer desperation. Nora did not waste a single second with questions. She reached out, grabbed the 2 children, and pulled them down the stone steps into the subterranean keep, with Samuel stumbling blindly behind them. The moment they entered the 58-degree warmth of the keep, the children began to cry a painful, gasping release as circulation returned to their frozen fingers and cheeks. Nora settled them immediately inside her wool blanket tent, wrapped them in dry, heated blankets, and placed warm river stones near their feet. She melted snow on her stove, stirred in 2 handfuls of cornmeal and a pinch of salt, and cooked a thick, steaming porridge. She fed the children with a wooden spoon, watching as the warm food and stable radiant heat brought the pink color back to their faces. Samuel sat on the stone floor, his back against the warm sandstone of the stove, his face buried in his hands, weeping silently with a combination of overwhelming relief and sheer physical exhaustion. He confessed that he had thought Nora was crazy when he heard she had walked into the western bluffs, but now he realized she was the only person in the entire county who possessed real wisdom. Nora waited until Samuel had eaten a bowl of warm porridge and rested for an hour. Then she picked up a piece of graphite and a flat, smooth slate stone from her work pile. She sat down beside Samuel and began drawing exact, detailed engineering blueprints of the subterranean keep. She drew the perimeter cold sink channel, explaining how cold air sinks and pooling it below floor level protects the living area. She detailed the exact 3 to 2-to-1 ratio for the sand, iron clay, and grass mortar, explaining how it prevented firebox cracking. She drew the high and low ventilation pipe angles that maintained a self-sustaining air pressure draft without losing heat. She handed the drawn slate and a copy on paper to Samuel, along with a 20-pound sack of dry pinto beans, 2 boxes of matches, and a bundle of dry cedar kindling. She told him that his wife and children could stay safely in her blanket tent for as long as needed, while he took her axe and tools to dig a cold sink shelter into the south-facing rise behind his own cabin. Word of the underground sanctuary spread like wildfire over the next 3 days. As the storm briefly lulled, Sarah Miller, a widowed mother from the valley, and Pastor Gideon Foss made the perilous trek up the bluff to find Nora. They found her not starving or freezing, but living in dry, comfortable 58-degree warmth, surrounded by adequate food and healthy livestock. Instead of turning them away or hoarding her father's secrets, Nora opened her door to everyone. She turned her subterranean room into a classroom. She spent hours walking the desperate homesteaders through the physical laws of thermal mass, earth sheltering, and moisture control. She gave them clay samples, showed them how to identify iron-rich soil beneath the snow, and drew blueprints for each family based on the specific terrain of their individual claims. Within a week, 8 different families across the valley had begun excavating subterranean cold sink shelters into the south slopes of their properties, using Nora's exact formulas to save their families from the killing cold.